You were never angry because of what they said. You were angry because something inside you needed their behavior to be different. This is the lie most people never question. They believe their emotions are reactions to the world, when in reality, their emotions are revelations about themselves. Every time someone gets under your skin, what is actually happening is not an invasion from the outside, but an activation from within. The world did not reach into you and pull a string. The string was already there. This is where emotional sovereignty begins, and where most people resist it. Modern culture quietly trains people to outsource their emotional state. From childhood, they are taught that certain behaviors justify certain feelings. If someone disrespects you, anger is justified. If someone ignores you, hurt is inevitable. If someone humiliates you, retaliation is natural. This logic feels reasonable. It is also the source of almost all psychological slavery. The Stoics understood something brutal and liberating at the same time. No one can endure your inner world without your participation. They cannot do it through words. They cannot do it through behavior. They can only do it by triggering something you have not yet made conscious. This is why two people can experience the same insult and respond entirely differently. One explodes. The other remains unmoved. The difference is not character. It is awareness. Carl Jung expressed this with terrifying precision. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. What he was pointing to is not philosophy, it is mechanics. The unconscious is not mysterious. It is simply the part of you that reacts faster than you can think. And anything that reacts faster than thought feels uncontrollable. Most people live their entire lives inside this mechanism. They wake up already slightly tense. They move through the day hyper-responsive to tone, expression, implication. A raised eyebrow becomes a threat. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A criticism becomes an attack on identity. They call this being sensitive, or passionate, or honest. In reality, it is reactivity disguised as authenticity. Emotional sovereignty is the moment you realize something uncomfortable. Your pain is real, but its source is internal. This does not mean other people are kind. It does not mean behavior does not matter. It means the power you believe others have over you has always been an illusion sustained by unexamined wounds. If someone ignores you and you feel small, the pain is not caused by the ignoring. It is caused by an unresolved need for validation. If someone criticizes you and you feel rage, the rage is not caused by the criticism. It is caused by a fragile self-image that cannot tolerate threat. If someone disrespects you and you feel humiliated, the humiliation is not imposed, it is activated. This is why emotional sovereignty feels offensive to the ego. It removes your favorite excuse. The Stoics never promised comfort. They promised freedom. Epictetus said it plainly, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Modern psychology would phrase it differently, but the mechanism is identical. Between stimulus and response, there is interpretation, and interpretation is where sovereignty either exists or collapses. Viktor Frankl, writing from the depths of a concentration camp, articulated the same truth from lived extremity. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. Most people never enter that space. They collapse into reaction before awareness even arrives. This is not because they are weak, it is because they are untrained. Emotional sovereignty is not suppression. It is not indifference. It is not becoming cold or detached. It is the capacity to feel without being possessed, to experience emotion without surrendering authority to it. Think of the mountain in a storm. The storm is real, the wind is violent, the rain is relentless, but the mountain does not move, not because it resists the storm, but because it does not negotiate with it. It allows the storm to pass without reorganizing itself around it. Most people are not mountains. They are weather vanes. They spin with every change in social pressure. Praise lifts them, criticism destroys them, attention intoxicates them, neglect devastates them. They call this being human. In reality, it is being uncentered. The Stoic project was not to eliminate emotion, but to eliminate enslavement to emotion. Marcus Aurelius did not write about calm because he lived in peace. He wrote about it because he ruled an empire surrounded by betrayal, war, and decay. His insight was not that emotions disappear, but that they lose their authority when examined. Carl Jung approached the same territory from a different direction. He saw that what we react to most violently in others is often what we have disowned in ourselves. The shadow is not evil, it is unconscious. And anything unconscious behaves like a saboteur. When someone provokes you, they are not attacking you directly. They are activating a fragment of your shadow. That fragment demands defense because it has never been integrated. This is why reactivity feels urgent and righteous. The ego believes it is fighting for survival. But survival is rarely what is at stake. What is at stake is image. Identity. The story you tell yourself about who you are. The moment you see this clearly, the game changes. Instead of asking, "Why did they do this to me?" you begin to ask, "What inside me needs their behavior to be different?" This question is not self-blame. It is self-reclamation. It returns power to its rightful place. This is where the observer mode begins. You are not your anger. You are not your hurt. You are not your anxiety. You are the awareness noticing these states arise. The instant you shift from being the emotion to observing the emotion, its grip weakens, not because you fought it, but because you stopped identifying with it. Neuroscience confirms this. Naming an emotional state activates the prefrontal cortex and down-regulates the amygdala. Ancient wisdom and modern science converge on the same mechanism. Awareness interrupts compulsion. When anger arises and you say internally, "Anger is present," you have already stepped back. When humiliation arises and you say, "The fear of rejection is activated," you have created space. In that space, sovereignty becomes possible. Most people fear this pause. They believe if they do not react immediately, they will lose power. In reality, the opposite is true. The most dangerous person in any interaction is not the loud one, but the composed one. Silence, when chosen rather than imposed, is not weakness, it is leverage. This is why the greatest power is not what you say, but what you withhold. Words spoken in reaction give control away. Words spoken from clarity shape reality. This is also why so many people feel betrayed by life. They are unconsciously operating under what can be called invisible contracts. If I am kind, they must respect me. If I help, they must appreciate me. If I stay loyal, they must not hurt me. These contracts were never signed. The world did not agree to them, and yet people enforce them emotionally, then feel wounded when reality violates terms that existed only in their own mind. Breaking these contracts does not make you bitter, it makes you free. When you release the expectation that others must behave in certain ways for you to remain whole, your nervous system relaxes. You no longer experience every deviation as a personal injury. You see behavior as information, not as verdict. This is where compassion becomes power, not sentimentality, but clarity. When someone lashes out, you can see the wound behind the behavior. They are bleeding on you. As the saying goes, this does not excuse harm. It contextualizes it, and context dissolves the need for reaction. A person who understands this does not need to dominate. They do not need to win. They do not need to prove anything. Their stillness becomes disarming. This is the paradox of emotional sovereignty. The less you need control, the more control you have. Most people believe emotional control means pushing feelings down. That is not control, that is compression, and anything compressed eventually explodes. True emotional sovereignty does not come from force. It comes from familiarity. This is why the Stoics practiced premeditatio malorum, the deliberate contemplation of adversity. They were not pessimists rehearsing misery. They were tacticians training their nervous systems. By imagining rejection, insult, loss, and inconvenience in advance, they removed the shock when those things appeared. The mind suffers most when it is surprised by reality. Preparation neutralizes surprise. Modern neuroscience supports this. Anticipated stress activates different neural pathways than unexpected stress. When adversity is mentally rehearsed, the amygdala's response is muted. The body does not interpret the event as an existential threat. Calm becomes accessible not because the situation is pleasant, but because it is recognized. This is the difference between the untrained and the trained mind. The untrained mind demands that life be gentle. The trained mind expects friction and therefore is not destabilized by it. Most emotional outbursts are not expressions of strength. They are signs of surprise. The person did not expect disrespect. They did not expect indifference. They did not expect contradiction. Their reaction is not courage, it is disorientation. Premeditatio malorum restores orientation. Imagine beginning the day knowing that someone may misunderstand you. Speak sharply, ignore your effort, or act unfairly, not with dread, but with acceptance. When it happens, the mind does not ask, "Why is this happening to me?" It says, "This is what humans do when they are afraid, stressed, or unconscious." The emotional charge collapses. This is why Stoicism is not passive. It is proactive. It trains the inner climate before the outer weather arrives. Carl Jung approached this same principle through shadow integration. He understood that what destabilizes us is not negativity itself, but unfamiliar negativity. When aspects of anger, envy, dominance, or vulnerability are denied, they gain power. When they are acknowledged, they lose their urgency. A man who has never met his own aggression will be controlled by it. A person who has never examined their need for approval will be shattered by rejection. Awareness does not eliminate these forces, it domesticates them. This is where most people misunderstand emotional sovereignty. They believe it means becoming soft or detached. In reality, it produces the opposite: unshakable presence. Presence is power because it cannot be manipulated. People attempt to provoke reactions because reactions are leverage. When someone knows which buttons to press, they control the interaction. The moment you stop reacting predictably, the game ends. Silence becomes unsettling. Calm becomes intimidating. The aggressor loses footing. This is not dominance through intimidation. It is dominance through non-participation. The greatest insult you can deliver to manipulation is not anger. It is irrelevance. This is why the most composed person in the room often holds the most power without speaking. They are not broadcasting insecurity. They are not signaling hunger for validation. Their stillness communicates self-sufficiency. Humans instinctively sense this. They either respect it or resent it, but they cannot ignore it. This brings us to the critical distinction between suppression and sovereignty. Suppression is avoidance disguised as strength. It requires constant effort. The suppressed emotion remains active underground, influencing behavior indirectly, through sarcasm, passive aggression, withdrawal, or sudden eruptions. The person appears calm, but the nervous system is rigid. Sovereignty is relaxed. It allows emotion to arise fully without granting it command. The feeling is acknowledged, felt, and released without becoming identity. There is no inner argument, no internal violence. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals recover quickly. They do not ruminate. They do not rehearse imaginary confrontations. They do not need to win in their head. Once the moment passes, it passes. Most people never experience this because they are addicted to reaction. Reaction gives a sense of immediacy, importance, and righteousness. It feels alive. Calm feels boring by comparison. But boredom is often the nervous system returning to baseline after chronic stimulation. The modern world conditions people to live in heightened reactivity. Algorithms reward outrage. Social dynamics reward performative emotion. Even identity is built around emotional positions: what one is offended by, what one opposes, what one defends. To step out of this system requires courage. Emotional sovereignty threatens the structures that profit from emotional volatility. A person who cannot be easily provoked is difficult to market to, manipulate, or mobilize irrationally. Their attention is not easily hijacked. Their decisions are slower, quieter, and more deliberate. This is why calm is often misinterpreted as weakness. It is safer for unstable systems to believe that reactivity equals authenticity. But the Stoics, and Jung after them, knew better. The highest form of masculinity, for example, is not aggression, it is containment. The ability to hold power without leaking it through impulsive action. The ability to feel anger without becoming it. The ability to remain centered while others spiral. This is not repression, it is mastery. A man who shouts has already lost control of the situation. A man who remains silent by choice controls the tempo. This is why the measure of a person is not what they say under pressure, but what they refuse to say. Restraint is not absence, it is surplus. This principle extends beyond gender. Anyone who cultivates emotional sovereignty experiences the same shift. Relationships change, conflicts shorten, respect increases without demand. The individual becomes less reactive, more selective, and more grounded. They no longer interpret every interaction as a referendum on their worth. Worth is no longer negotiated externally. This is the ultimate freedom emotional sovereignty provides: self-definition without dependence. When you no longer require others to validate your emotional state, you are no longer hostage to their behavior. Praise becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Criticism becomes information rather than injury. Disrespect becomes a reflection of the other person's inner state, not a verdict on yours. This does not mean tolerating abuse. It means responding from clarity rather than compulsion. Clear responses are brief. They are proportional. They are final. The emotionally sovereign person does not argue to be understood. They act in alignment with their values and let misunderstanding exist. They do not chase closure from those incapable of providing it. They close internally and move forward. This is why emotional sovereignty often looks lonely at first. It removes you from familiar dramas. It disrupts patterns where emotional volatility was mistaken for intimacy. Some people will accuse you of becoming cold, distant, or arrogant. What they are actually sensing is your independence. Independence is threatening to those who rely on emotional hooks. And yet, paradoxically, this independence deepens genuine connection. When emotional reactions are no longer automatic, relationships become chosen rather than compulsive. Presence becomes intentional. Boundaries become natural rather than defensive. This is not emotional withdrawal. It is emotional clarity. From here, the essay will continue into the deeper implications of emotional sovereignty, how it reshapes leadership, relationships, identity, and the experience of meaning itself. and why the calm individual often becomes the gravitational center around which chaos organizes. Power is often misunderstood because it is confused with noise. Most people associate power with visibility, volume, dominance, assertion, emotional intensity. The loudest voice in the room is assumed to be the strongest. The most reactive person is mistaken for the most passionate. In reality, these are signs of instability, not authority. True power does not need to announce itself. It regulates. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often become leaders without trying to. They do not chase influence. Influence gathers around them, not because they demand loyalty, but because they provide something rare in a chaotic environment: predictability of presence. People trust those whose reactions are stable. A person who reacts explosively introduces uncertainty. Others must constantly calculate how to approach them, what tone to use, what topics to avoid. Emotional volatility creates social friction. It exhausts groups. It erodes confidence. By contrast, the emotionally sovereign person is consistent. They do not oscillate wildly based on mood or circumstance. Their response today resembles their response yesterday. This does not mean they are rigid. It means they are grounded. Grounded people create psychological safety. This is why the calm leader is often more effective than the charismatic one. Charisma excites. Calm stabilizes. Excitement burns quickly. Stability endures. In crisis, people do not look for entertainment. They look for orientation. Orientation comes from someone who is not lost in their own emotional reaction. This principle is as old as human groups. Tribal elders were not chosen because they were the loudest or the most aggressive. They were chosen because they were the least reactive. They could listen without collapsing, decide without panicking, act without dramatizing. The Stoics understood leadership as an internal state before it was an external role. Marcus Aurelius did not write for an audience. He wrote to himself. His power came not from command, but from self-regulation. His journal reveals a man constantly reminding himself not to be ruled by impulse, anger, or pride. This is the unseen work of authority. Carl Jung observed a similar pattern in psychology. He noted that individuals who had integrated their shadow, who had faced their own capacity for aggression, fear, and vulnerability, were less likely to project those qualities onto others. They did not need enemies to define themselves. They did not need scapegoats to stabilize their identity. Projection is weakness pretending to be conviction. When a leader reacts emotionally to criticism, it signals insecurity. When they respond calmly, it signals confidence, not arrogance. Confidence. Confidence does not need defense. This distinction matters because emotional sovereignty is not only a personal virtue. It is a structural force. Organizations, families, and societies mirror the emotional maturity of those at their center. When leaders are reactive, systems become unstable. When leaders are sovereign, systems self-regulate. This is why chaos tends to orbit around unresolved people. Emotional fragmentation radiates outward. The internal becomes external. Conversely, clarity has a gravitational effect. People bring problems to those who can hold them without amplifying them. They defer to those who do not collapse under pressure. Authority emerges naturally when emotional containment is visible. This does not mean emotionally sovereign individuals avoid conflict. They engage with it differently. They do not escalate. They do not personalize. They do not dramatize. They address the issue directly, proportionally, and without surplus emotion. This often feels disarming to others, because it removes the emotional theater most conflicts depend on to sustain themselves. Conflict thrives on reactivity. Remove reactivity, and conflict starves. This is why silence is often the most effective response, not passive silence, but intentional silence. Silence that communicates, I am not threatened, and I am not required to respond to this. Many people fear silence because it removes the illusion of control. Speaking feels like action. Silence feels like vulnerability. In reality, silence places the burden back where it belongs, on the person attempting to provoke. This is why emotional sovereignty is often mistaken for indifference. It is not indifference, it is discernment. Discernment chooses when engagement is meaningful and when it is wasteful. A sovereign individual does not enter every emotional exchange they are invited into. They do not accept every provocation as a challenge. They recognize that attention is currency, and they spend it deliberately. This principle reshapes relationships profoundly. When emotional reactions are no longer automatic, people stop being able to manipulate through guilt, fear, or pressure. Emotional blackmail loses effectiveness. Drama loses leverage. The relationship either recalibrates around mutual respect, or dissolves. This is why emotional sovereignty often precedes relational change. Some connections strengthen, others end, not because of hostility, but because the old emotional contracts no longer function. This can feel isolating at first. When you stop reacting the way people expect, they experience uncertainty. Some will attempt to reassert control through escalation. Others will withdraw. A few will adapt. This phase is unavoidable. But on the other side of it lies a quieter, more authentic form of connection. Relationships based on choice rather than compulsion. Respect rather than dependency. Presence rather than performance. This is where emotional sovereignty reveals its deeper implication. It is not about control, it is about freedom. Freedom from being managed by others' moods. Freedom from internal chaos. Freedom from the need to explain, justify, or defend your emotional state. This freedom is unsettling to a culture built on emotional exchange, but it is stabilizing to the individual. From here, the essay will move into its final depth: how emotional sovereignty reshapes identity itself. Why most suffering is identity-based rather than situational, and how the fully sovereign individual relates to meaning, time, and mortality without collapse. At the deepest level, emotional injury is not about what happens. It is about who you think you are when it happens. Every feeling of offense presupposes an identity that believes it can be diminished. Every surge of anger assumes a self-image that must be defended. Every spiral of shame assumes a standard that has been violated. Without these internal structures, the emotional charge collapses. This is why emotional sovereignty cannot be separated from identity. Most people believe they suffer because life is difficult. In truth, they suffer because their identity is fragile. The more rigid the identity, the more easily it cracks. The more you insist on being seen in a particular way, respected, admired, validated, feared, the more power you hand to anyone capable of threatening that image. Insults only work when they strike something defended. This is why the Stoics relentlessly attacked the illusion of reputation as a source of worth. They saw that dependence on external opinion is psychological captivity. If your sense of self rises and falls with how you are perceived, you do not possess yourself. You are possessed by the crowd. Carl Jung approached the same realization through individuation. He understood that a mature psyche does not cling to a single narrative about itself. It contains contradiction, strength and weakness, confidence and doubt, light and shadow. When these elements are acknowledged, there is nothing left to protect. A person who has integrated their shadow cannot be humiliated, because they already know their limitations. They cannot be destabilized by accusation, because they are not pretending to be pure. They cannot be shattered by rejection, because their worth is not contingent on acceptance. This is why emotional sovereignty feels paradoxical. It requires humility before it produces strength. Humility here does not mean self-denigration. It means accuracy, seeing oneself clearly, without inflation or collapse. The ego resists this because it survives on exaggeration, either of greatness or of injury. Accuracy dissolves drama. Drama is identity maintenance. Most emotional suffering is not pain. It is the story about pain. The narrative that says, "This should not have happened. This means something about me. This proves I am unsafe." These narratives arise automatically because the mind seeks coherence. But coherence built on false premises generates suffering. Emotional sovereignty interrupts the narrative loop. When something painful occurs and the mind reaches for meaning, the sovereign response is not interpretation, but observation. A sensation is present, a thought is arising, an urge to react is forming. This may sound subtle. It is not. It is revolutionary. Because the moment you stop asking what it means about you, the event loses its power to define you. This is where existential freedom appears, not as abstraction, but as lived experience. You realize that your essence is not contained in your reactions, that you exist prior to emotion, prior to identity, prior to narrative. Emotions become weather patterns passing through awareness, not verdicts on your being. This does not make life sterile. It makes it spacious. Space is what most people lack. They live crowded inside their own mind, crowded with expectations, interpretations, imagined judgments. Emotional sovereignty clears space. In that space, choice becomes possible, not forced choice, real choice. The ability to choose how much something matters. This ability is what separates adults from children psychologically. A child reacts because they must. An adult chooses because they can. Many people grow older without ever making this transition. Their body ages. Their emotional structure does not. This is why emotional sovereignty is rare. It requires responsibility without blame, power without domination, awareness without detachment. It requires seeing oneself as the site of experience rather than its victim. When this shift occurs, time itself changes. Emotional reactions collapse time into urgency. Everything feels immediate, absolute, final. Sovereignty restores perspective. The moment expands. The future re-enters awareness. Long-term consequences matter again. This is why sovereign individuals rarely sabotage themselves. They are not governed by momentary relief. They can tolerate discomfort without seeking escape. They can endure misunderstanding without rushing to correct it. They can let tension exist without compulsively dissolving it. This tolerance is not numbness. It is capacity. Capacity to feel deeply without drowning. Capacity to care without clinging. Capacity to engage without losing oneself. This is the final inversion most people never grasp. Emotional sovereignty does not make you less human, it makes you more so. It restores proportion. It returns emotion to its proper role as information, not command. When you reach this state, the world does not become kinder, but it becomes clearer. People reveal themselves quickly. Manipulation becomes obvious. Drama becomes transparent. You no longer waste energy deciphering hidden meanings or defending imagined threats. Life simplifies. This simplicity is not minimalism. It is precision. You say less, but what you say lands. You react less, but when you act, it matters. You explain less, but your presence communicates enough. This is why the most sovereign individuals often appear quiet, not because they lack thought, but because they lack urgency. They are not racing to be understood. They are not competing for emotional territory. They have already claimed the only territory that matters, their inner state. This is the ultimate form of freedom available to a human being. Freedom not from circumstance, but from compulsion. Freedom not from pain, but from suffering layered on top of pain. Freedom not from emotion, but from being ruled by it. Everything else, status, security, recognition, is secondary. When you possess yourself, the world can no longer take you hostage. And that is why the calm individual, the one who does not flinch when others escalate, who does not chase validation or retaliate for dignity, who does not collapse under pressure, that person quietly holds the highest form of power available in a social world. Not the power to dominate others, but the power to remain whole in their presence. The real test of emotional sovereignty does not happen in moments of meditation or reflection. It happens in traffic, in conversations, in conflict, in disappointment, in being misunderstood. It happens when the world does not slow down to accommodate your clarity. This is where most philosophies collapse, at the point of application. They sound elegant in abstraction and disappear under pressure. Stoicism and depth psychology endure because they were forged precisely where pressure is highest, in ordinary human interaction. Consider how most people experience daily friction. A colleague interrupts them, a partner forgets something important, a stranger speaks harshly, a message goes unanswered. Each of these moments carries a potential emotional charge. The untrained mind reacts immediately, often before awareness arrives. Tone sharpens, posture tightens, words are released without consent. Afterward comes justification. They deserved it. I was right. Anyone would feel this way. These justifications are not explanations. They are anesthetics. They dull the discomfort of recognizing one's own lack of control. Emotional sovereignty begins when you refuse anesthesia. Instead of asking whether your reaction was justified, you ask whether it was chosen. This single question dismantles most emotional habits. If the reaction was not chosen, it was automatic. If it was automatic, it was inherited, from conditioning, from past wounds, from unconscious patterns. And what is inherited can be retrained. This is why sovereignty is not a personality trait. It is a discipline. Discipline here does not mean harshness. It means repetition. The repeated act of noticing before responding. The repeated act of allowing sensation to peak and pass without interference. The repeated act of choosing alignment with values over alignment with impulse. At first, this feels artificial. The mind resists it. It feels slow. It feels unnatural. This resistance is the nervous system losing its monopoly. Over time, something shifts. The pause becomes familiar. The gap between stimulus and response widens. The emotional surge still arises, but it no longer hijacks behavior. You begin to feel emotions fully and briefly, instead of partially and endlessly. This is one of the great paradoxes. Emotions dissipate faster when they are not resisted or indulged. Most people prolong emotion by fighting it or feeding it. They replay events, rehearse arguments, imagine alternate outcomes. This rumination feels like processing. It is not. It is fixation. Sovereignty replaces fixation with presence. Presence does not ask, how do I get rid of this feeling? It asks, can I allow this feeling to exist without acting on it? This question changes the entire relationship with discomfort. Discomfort becomes information, not instruction. From this perspective, boundaries become clearer. You no longer set boundaries reactively, through anger or withdrawal. You set them calmly, early, and without emotional surplus. You do not wait until resentment builds. You do not justify excessively. You state what is acceptable and move on. People sense this immediately. A boundary stated without anger carries more authority than one shouted in frustration. Anger signals that the boundary has already been violated internally. Calm signals that the boundary exists regardless of external behavior. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals are often perceived as confident even when they say little. Their behavior is consistent with their values. They do not negotiate their self-respect emotionally. They do not plead for understanding. They understand themselves first. In relationships, this creates a profound shift. Emotional sovereignty removes the need to test others. There is no probing for reassurance, no indirect signaling, no emotional leverage. Needs are communicated clearly or released consciously. Attachment becomes choice rather than compulsion. This does not make relationships effortless. It makes them honest. Honesty is uncomfortable for those accustomed to emotional bargaining, but it is liberating for those who value clarity. Over time, relationships either deepen or dissolve. Both outcomes are healthy. In conflict, sovereignty changes the geometry entirely. Most conflicts are not about the issue presented. They are about threatened identity. Who is right? Who is respected? Who is seen? When identity is not at stake, conflict becomes solvable. It turns into a problem to address, not a self to defend. This is why emotionally sovereign people rarely escalate conflicts. They do not interpret disagreement as danger. They listen without collapsing. They respond without urgency. They disengage without resentment when resolution is impossible. Disengagement is another misunderstood form of power. Leaving an argument without emotional charge is not avoidance. It is refusal to participate in dysfunction. It communicates self-respect without hostility. It preserves energy for situations where engagement is meaningful. Energy management is central to sovereignty. Reactive people leak energy constantly. Every slight consumes them. Every misunderstanding demands explanation. Every emotional ripple requires attention. Sovereign people conserve energy. They allocate it deliberately. They understand that attention is finite and treat it accordingly. This conservation creates depth. Depth of thought. Depth of relationship. Depth of presence. It also creates resilience. Resilience is not the absence of stress. It is the ability to recover without fragmentation. Emotionally sovereign individuals still experience stress, grief, and disappointment. What they do not experience is prolonged disintegration. They bend without breaking. They grieve without collapsing. They feel pain without losing orientation. This resilience often looks like emotional maturity to others. But maturity is not an age. It is a relationship with inner experience. From here, the essay will continue into an even quieter territory. How emotional sovereignty reshapes one's relationship with meaning, mortality, and time, and why the sovereign individual no longer needs life to make sense in order to live well. At some point, every philosophy worth anything must face the one event no human can negotiate with: death. Most people do not fear death directly. They fear loss of control, loss of identity, loss of unfinished narratives. They fear disappearing before being seen, understood, or validated. Death terrifies the ego because it represents the ultimate withdrawal of attention. This is why emotional sovereignty is inseparable from mortality awareness. A reactive person cannot face death calmly. Because they cannot face the present calmly, their mind is already fragmented by imagined futures and unresolved pasts. Death appears as annihilation because their identity is stretched across time, dependent on continuation. The sovereign individual relates to time differently. When emotional reactions no longer dictate meaning, life is no longer experienced as a race toward fulfillment. Moments are not merely steps toward something else. They are complete in themselves. This does not make ambition disappear. It removes desperation from it. Desperation is what makes death intolerable. The Stoics trained themselves to remember death daily, not as morbidity, but as calibration. Memento mori was not a slogan. It was a discipline. It stripped trivial concerns of authority. It reminded them that reputation, insult, praise, and humiliation dissolve at the same rate. When you know this viscerally, emotional volatility begins to look absurd. Why be consumed by what cannot follow you? Carl Jung observed that the second half of life requires a different orientation. The drive for expansion, achievement, and recognition gradually gives way to integration, meaning, and inward coherence. Those who resist this transition suffer profoundly. Those who accept it discover a quieter fulfillment. Emotional sovereignty accelerates this transition. It allows a person to live with the awareness of finitude without panic. Loss becomes painful but not destabilizing. Grief is experienced fully, but it does not erase identity. The individual does not collapse into meaninglessness when something ends. Endings are recognized as structural, not personal. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often appear less anxious about the future. Not because they believe it will be kind, but because they no longer require it to be kind in order to remain whole. Hope, in this context, is no longer emotional bargaining. It becomes orientation without attachment. This orientation reshapes how time is inhabited. Reactive individuals live in anticipation and regret. The present is merely a staging ground for imagined outcomes. Sovereign individuals live primarily in contact. They plan, but they do not postpone living. They remember, but they do not dwell. Contact with the present does not eliminate suffering. It reduces unnecessary multiplication of it. This has profound implications for meaning. Most people believe meaning must be discovered, defined, or assigned. They search for it in careers, relationships, legacy, or belief systems. When these structures fail, they experience existential collapse. Emotional sovereignty reveals something counterintuitive. Meaning is not something you find. It is something that emerges when inner conflict quiets. When the mind is no longer fighting itself, ordinary actions regain significance. Work becomes expression rather than compensation. Relationships become encounters rather than transactions. Solitude becomes nourishing rather than threatening. This is why sovereign individuals often appear content with less explanation. They do not need grand narratives to justify existence. They live with a sense of alignment that does not require articulation. This alignment is what many mistake for enlightenment, happiness, or peace. It is none of those as ideals. It is simply coherence. Coherence between values and behavior. Coherence between emotion and awareness. Coherence between inner state and outer action. Coherence is rare, and where it appears, suffering decreases. This does not make the individual morally superior. It makes them psychologically stable. Stability is not flashy. It does not trend. It does not perform well in a culture addicted to emotional spectacle. But it is what endures. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often withdraw slightly from mass emotional currents. Not in isolation, but in selectivity. They do not amplify outrage. They do not consume drama as identity. They observe without absorption. This withdrawal is not disengagement from life. It is disengagement from chaos. Chaos requires participation. The world will always provide stimuli. It will always offer outrage, fear, comparison, and urgency. Emotional sovereignty is the capacity to choose which of these deserve entry. This choice is the final form of freedom. Freedom not from pain, but from being ruled by it. Freedom not from loss, but from collapse. Freedom not from emotion, but from compulsion. At this point, the individual no longer asks life to guarantee happiness, meaning, or justice. They ask only for clarity of perception and integrity of response. And in this posture, something subtle but profound occurs. Life feels lighter. Not because burdens disappear, but because the self is no longer carrying unnecessary weight. Emotional baggage falls away, identity loosens, expectations soften. What remains is presence, quiet, durable, sufficient. This is the state from which true generosity arises. Not generosity as performance, but as overflow. When the inner world is no longer consumed by defense, energy becomes available for creation, care, and contribution. The sovereign individual does not save the world. They stabilize their corner of it. And stability is contagious. From here, the essay will move toward its final synthesis. Emotional sovereignty not as a technique, but as a way of being, not as control, but as alignment, not as detachment, but as deep engagement without self-loss. At a certain point, emotional sovereignty stops being something you practice and becomes something you inhabit. It is no longer a technique you apply in moments of stress. It becomes the default posture from which you meet the world, not because you are constantly vigilant, but because vigilance is no longer required. The nervous system has learned that it is safe to remain open without being unprotected. This is the point where control dissolves into alignment. Control implies force. Alignment implies coherence. Control fights impulses. Alignment renders many impulses unnecessary. The sovereign individual does not spend their energy restraining themselves. They spend it understanding themselves. This is why emotional sovereignty is not rigid. It is fluid. Rigidity belongs to fear. Sovereignty belongs to confidence. A rigid person must constantly maintain their position. A sovereign person adjusts without losing center. They can yield without surrendering. They can stand firm without hardening. This flexibility is often misread as ambiguity. In reality, it is precision. The sovereign individual knows what matters to them and what does not. They do not require certainty in every domain. They are comfortable with not knowing, because their identity is not built on being right. Curiosity replaces defensiveness. Inquiry replaces reaction. This is where emotional sovereignty intersects with wisdom. Wisdom is not accumulated information. It is the capacity to respond appropriately to complexity. Appropriateness requires emotional regulation. Without it, intelligence becomes weaponized anxiety. A brilliant mind without emotional sovereignty is a liability to itself and others. This is why so many intelligent people suffer disproportionately. Their cognitive capacity amplifies emotional chaos rather than stabilizing it. They overthink, overinterpret, overreact. Their inner world becomes crowded with possibilities, none of which are grounded. Sovereignty grounds thought. When emotion no longer hijacks cognition, thinking becomes clearer, decisions simplify, values guide action. The mind no longer oscillates between extremes. It moves deliberately. This deliberateness changes how one engages with ambition. Ambition, without sovereignty, is compensatory. It attempts to fill perceived lack. It seeks achievement as proof of worth. Failure becomes catastrophic. Success becomes addictive. Ambition, with sovereignty, becomes expressive. It is no longer about becoming enough. It is about contributing what is already present. Failure is instructive. Success is enjoyed without dependence. This distinction reshapes one's entire relationship with effort. Effort becomes sustainable. Burnout recedes. The constant pressure to justify existence through productivity eases. Work regains dignity because it is no longer tasked with providing identity. Identity has been internalized. This internalization is the quiet revolution most people never make. They outsource identity to roles, titles, relationships, and recognition. When these structures shift, as they inevitably do, collapse follows. Emotional sovereignty builds identity on something more stable: awareness, values, and chosen conduct. This identity does not need defense. It can be questioned without disintegration. It can evolve without betrayal. It can be misunderstood without injury. Misunderstanding becomes tolerable when self-understanding is sufficient. This is why the sovereign individual rarely feels the urge to correct every misperception. They let others be wrong, not because truth does not matter, but because not every misunderstanding is worth the cost of engagement. Engagement becomes selective. This selectivity often looks like detachment to those accustomed to constant emotional exchange. But it is not detachment from people. It is detachment from compulsive interaction. Compulsion is the enemy of freedom. The sovereign individual chooses connection rather than being pulled into it. They choose conversation rather than being dragged into argument. They choose silence rather than being forced into defense. These choices accumulate. Over time, life takes on a different texture. Days feel less crowded. Even difficult periods contain moments of quiet clarity. Emotional storms still occur, but they pass without destroying internal structure. This is resilience in its purest form. Resilience is not toughness. It is elasticity, the ability to bend without breaking, to feel without fragmenting, to lose without collapsing. This elasticity is what allows emotionally sovereign individuals to face life as it is, rather than as they wish it to be. They do not demand fairness from existence. They do not interpret suffering as cosmic betrayal. They meet difficulty with sobriety, not cynicism. They act where action is possible and accept where acceptance is required. This balance is rare because it cannot be faked. It is not a performance. It is a consequence. A consequence of sustained attention. A consequence of honest self-examination. A consequence of choosing responsibility over blame. Responsibility here does not mean fault. It means authorship. Authorship of response. Authorship of meaning. Authorship of one's inner climate. This authorship is the deepest form of dignity available to a human being. Dignity does not come from status or recognition. It comes from self-possession, from knowing that regardless of what occurs externally, one's inner state is not surrendered without consent. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals are difficult to humiliate. Humiliation requires cooperation. Without internal agreement, it fails to land. They may feel pain, they may feel disappointment, but they do not feel reduced. Reduction is what destroys people. To be reduced to a role, an emotion, a mistake, a moment, that is psychological violence. Emotional sovereignty protects against this violence not by denial, but by dimensionality. The sovereign self is too spacious to be reduced. This spaciousness is the final gift of the path. Not enlightenment, not invulnerability, but room. Room to feel. Room to choose. Room to live without constant inner negotiation. In this room, life unfolds without needing to justify itself. Meaning is not hunted. It arises quietly from coherence. From the simple fact of living in alignment with what one knows to be true. This is not a dramatic ending. It is a sustainable one. The emotionally sovereign individual does not seek to dominate the world. They seek to remain intact within it, and in doing so, they influence it more than those who try to control it. Because calm is contagious. Clarity is stabilizing. And a person who possesses themselves becomes a reference point in a disoriented world. This is emotional sovereignty. Not as an ideal. Not as a goal. But as a way of being that makes freedom ordinary. There is a reason emotional sovereignty is spoken of far less than it is desired. It threatens the psychological economy most people unconsciously rely on. Many individuals do not actually want sovereignty. They want relief without responsibility. They want peace without giving up the right to blame. They want calm without confronting the structures inside themselves that generate chaos. Emotional sovereignty offers none of these compromises. It demands that you stop outsourcing your inner state. This is why it often feels lonely at first. When you withdraw from habitual reactivity, you also withdraw from shared emotional scripts. Complaining bonds people. Outrage bonds people. Mutual resentment creates intimacy faster than honesty ever could. When you no longer participate in these exchanges, you step outside the familiar social glue. Others may interpret this as distance. In truth, it is independence. Independence exposes a subtle truth. Much of what passes for connection is mutual dysregulation. People synchronize their emotional instability and call it closeness. When one person stabilizes, the synchronization breaks. This can feel threatening to those who relied on emotional mirroring to feel seen. The sovereign individual does not reject others. They simply refuse to co-regulate dysfunction. This refusal is often mistaken for superiority. It is not. It is self-preservation. Self-preservation here does not mean avoidance of life. It means refusal to be fragmented by it. Fragmentation is the hidden epidemic of modern psychology. People are pulled in too many emotional directions simultaneously. They care deeply about too many things they cannot influence. They react to too many stimuli they did not choose. Over time, this produces exhaustion, cynicism, and despair. Emotional sovereignty is the antidote, not by shrinking the world, but by shrinking identification. When fewer things are taken personally, fewer things wound deeply, when fewer reactions are automatic, fewer mistakes are made under pressure, the person becomes harder to destabilize not because they are armored, but because they are less entangled. Entanglement is the true source of suffering. The Stoics understood entanglement as attachment to externals. Jung understood it as unconscious identification. Modern psychology understands it as fusion, being fused with thoughts, emotions, and narratives. Different languages, same insight. To be sovereign is to be diffused. Diffusion does not make you indifferent. It makes you precise. You care where caring is appropriate. You invest where investment is meaningful. You withdraw where engagement would be corrosive. This precision is rare because it requires discernment under pressure. Pressure reveals whether emotional sovereignty is theoretical or embodied. Anyone can speak calmly in ideal conditions. Few can maintain clarity when misunderstood, challenged, or dismissed. This is where training matters. Sovereignty is trained not by avoiding difficulty, but by meeting it consciously. Each moment of restraint strengthens capacity. Each moment of observation weakens compulsion. Over time, the nervous system rewires. Reactivity loses speed, awareness arrives sooner. This process is gradual, there is no sudden transformation. And this frustrates people conditioned by instant results. They want emotional mastery as a concept. They want to understand it intellectually. But sovereignty is not understood into existence. It is practiced into embodiment. This is why knowledge alone changes little. Many people can articulate Stoic principles perfectly while remaining deeply reactive. Many can quote Jung while being ruled by their shadow. Insight without integration produces arrogance, not freedom. Integration is slow because it requires repetition in moments that matter. The sovereign individual has failed many times. They have reacted, regretted, observed, and recalibrated. They have felt the cost of impulse and the relief of restraint. They have chosen differently often enough for new patterns to stabilize. This is why sovereignty carries a quiet confidence. It is not borrowed from ideology. It is earned through experience. This confidence does not announce itself. It does not need to. It is felt by others as steadiness. People relax around it. Conversations slow. Conflicts soften. Even aggression loses momentum when it cannot find purchase. Aggression feeds on reaction. Remove reaction, and aggression starves. This is not moral theory. It is behavioral mechanics. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals are often targeted initially. Unstable systems test stability. Provocation is an attempt to reassert familiar dynamics. If the sovereign individual reacts, they are pulled back into the old game. If they do not, the game dissolves. This phase is uncomfortable. It requires enduring misunderstanding without correction. It requires allowing others to form inaccurate narratives. It requires trusting one's internal alignment more than external perception. Most people cannot tolerate this. They rush to explain, they defend, they justify, In doing so, they surrender sovereignty for relief. Relief is short-term, sovereignty is long-term. This is the trade-off few are willing to make. But for those who do, something remarkable happens. Life becomes quieter without becoming smaller. The mind no longer runs endless simulations of confrontation. Emotional residue dissipates faster, sleep improves, decision fatigue lessens, the body relaxes because it is no longer preparing for constant psychological threat. This physiological shift is not incidental. Emotional sovereignty is embodied regulation. It changes posture, breathing, tone, and tempo. Others sense this subconsciously. They respond differently without knowing why. This is why sovereignty alters social dynamics without overt action. People interrupt you less. They push boundaries less. They sense that emotional leverage will not work. Respect emerges not because you demand it, but because you do not need it. Needing respect repels it. Possessing self-respect attracts it. This is the inversion that defines the entire path. From here, the essay will continue to deepen into how emotional sovereignty reshapes creativity, intimacy, and moral courage, and why the fully sovereign individual becomes capable of standing alone without becoming isolated. Creativity collapses in a reactive mind. This is a truth few want to hear because creativity is often romanticized as emotional chaos, intensity, turbulence, passion without restraint. In reality, sustained creativity requires inner stability, not emotional flatness, but emotional availability. A mind constantly hijacked by reactivity cannot remain open long enough for anything original to emerge. The sovereign individual creates from surplus, not from lack. When emotion no longer demands constant management, attention becomes free. Free attention is the raw material of creativity. It allows ideas to incubate without being forced. It tolerates uncertainty without panic. It sustains effort without desperation. Most people sabotage their creative potential by tying it to identity. Their work becomes proof of worth. Criticism becomes existential threat. Praise becomes dependency. In this state, creation turns into performance. Performance exhausts. Expression endures. Emotional sovereignty returns creativity to expression. The work is done because it needs to be done, not because it needs to validate the self. Failure becomes instructive rather than humiliating. Success becomes information rather than intoxication. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. The same applies to love. Love without emotional sovereignty is attachment disguised as intimacy. It seeks regulation through another person. It demands reassurance. It fears abandonment not because loss is painful, which it is, but because identity has been outsourced. This kind of love is intense and fragile. Sovereign love is quieter. It does not cling. It does not test. It does not threaten itself to feel alive. It chooses connection without demanding completion. This does not make love weaker. It makes it resilient. Two sovereign individuals can disagree without destabilizing the bond. They can experience distance without panic. They can allow each other to change without interpreting it as betrayal. The relationship becomes a meeting of two centers, not a fusion of insecurities. This form of love is rare because it requires tolerating aloneness. Aloneness is not loneliness. Loneliness is the pain of needing others to fill an internal void. Aloneness is the capacity to be with oneself without collapse. Emotional sovereignty transforms loneliness into aloneness. This transformation is often misunderstood. When someone becomes sovereign, they may appear more solitary. They withdraw from performative sociality. They stop seeking stimulation as proof of connection. This withdrawal is not retreat from humanity. It is retreat from noise. Noise is comforting to those who fear stillness. Stillness confronts you with yourself. Carl Jung warned that avoiding solitude prevents individuation. Without time alone, the psyche cannot differentiate itself from collective expectation. Emotional sovereignty requires solitude not as escape, but as calibration. In solitude, reactions slow, motives clarify, values surface. The self separates from borrowed scripts. This separation is uncomfortable at first. It dismantles illusions. But it is necessary. Without it, moral courage never develops. Moral courage is impossible without emotional sovereignty. It requires the ability to stand alone without collapsing into fear or rage. It requires the capacity to act according to principle rather than approval. It requires restraint when outrage would be rewarded. The reactive individual cannot sustain moral courage. They are too dependent on external affirmation. They mistake alignment with the group for integrity. When the group shifts, so do they. The sovereign individual acts from internal reference. This does not make them inflexible. It makes them anchored. They can revise beliefs without humiliation. They can admit error without self-annihilation. They can resist injustice without becoming consumed by hatred. Hatred is what destroys movements from within. History repeatedly shows that revolutions fueled by unchecked emotion devour their own ideals. Moral clarity without emotional sovereignty turns into fanaticism. Passion without restraint becomes cruelty justified by righteousness. The Stoics understood this danger intuitively. Jung articulated it psychologically. Power without integration corrupts. Conviction without self-awareness blinds. Emotional sovereignty is what prevents strength from becoming violence. It allows a person to confront injustice without losing humanity, to oppose without dehumanizing, to act decisively without becoming possessed by action. This balance is extraordinarily difficult. It is also indispensable. The sovereign individual does not seek purity. They seek proportion. They understand that the world is complex and that certainty is often a sign of unexamined emotion. They move carefully, not timidly. They speak precisely, not loudly. Their courage is quiet. This quiet courage does not attract attention immediately. It does not trend. It does not provoke applause. But it endures. Over time, it becomes a reference point. Others begin to orient around it, often without realizing why. This is how change actually happens. Not through emotional contagion, but through stability. Not through outrage, but through example. Not through dominance, but through coherence. From here, the essay will continue to expand into the final long arc. How emotional sovereignty reshapes one's relationship with society at large, media, politics, culture, and why the sovereign individual becomes increasingly difficult to manipulate in a world built on emotional extraction. Modern society does not merely tolerate emotional reactivity. It requires it. Entire systems are designed around predictable emotional responses. Media depends on outrage. Advertising depends on insecurity. Politics depends on fear and tribal identification. Social platforms depend on validation hunger. None of these structures function well in the presence of emotionally sovereign individuals. Sovereignty breaks the feedback loop. A reactive person is easy to steer. You present a stimulus, you receive a reaction, you repeat. Over time, patterns stabilize. The individual believes they are choosing freely, while their nervous system is being trained. This is not conspiracy, it is conditioning. The sovereign individual disrupts this mechanism simply by not responding on cue. The expected outrage does not arrive. The anticipated fear does not escalate. The manufactured urgency falls flat. Attention does not spike. Engagement does not follow. In systems built on extraction of attention and emotion, non-participation is a form of resistance. This resistance is quiet. It does not protest. It does not announce itself. It simply withholds fuel. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals are difficult to radicalize. They do not confuse emotional intensity with truth. They notice when language is designed to provoke rather than inform. They sense when narratives are constructed to bypass reflection. They pause. The pause is fatal to manipulation. Most manipulation relies on speed. It must move faster than awareness. It must trigger before analysis. This is why headlines are inflammatory. Why messaging is compressed. Why nuance is punished. Reflection slows contagion. Emotional sovereignty restores reflection. This does not make the individual disengaged from society. It makes them selective. They still care about injustice, suffering, and ethical responsibility. What they do not do is allow their emotional state to be hijacked as leverage. They ask different questions. Not, how does this make me feel? But, what is this trying to make me feel, and why? This question alone immunizes against a remarkable amount of psychological exploitation. Carl Jung warned of this dynamic long before the digital age. He observed that when individuals lack a strong inner center, they become susceptible to collective possession. Crowds amplify unconscious impulses. Emotion spreads faster than thought. Identity dissolves into mass movement. The sovereign individual does not dissolve easily. They can participate without being absorbed. They can disagree without demonizing. They can acknowledge complexity without paralysis. Their stance is not neutral. It is measured. Measurement is what mass emotion lacks. This measured stance is often misinterpreted as apathy by those who equate caring with reacting. But caring that is constantly reactive is unsustainable. It burns out. It becomes cynical. It collapses into despair or aggression. Sovereign caring endures. It chooses where to act and where to abstain. It recognizes that not every battle is worth the cost of engagement. It understands that moral energy is finite and must be conserved for moments where it can actually change something. This conservation is strategic, not selfish. It allows the individual to remain effective over time, to act without becoming consumed, to contribute without being hollowed out. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often appear older than their age. Not in fatigue, but in perspective. They have seen enough cycles to recognize patterns. They are not easily seduced by novelty or alarm. They do not mistake intensity for importance. This perspective alters how they consume information. They read more slowly, they verify more often, they resist the pressure to form immediate opinions. They allow ambiguity to exist without rushing to resolution. This frustrates systems that depend on instant alignment. Ambiguity is dangerous to those who need certainty to mobilize. The sovereign individual tolerates ambiguity because their identity is not threatened by it. They do not need to be right immediately. They are comfortable being partially informed. They adjust as new information emerges. This flexibility is another form of strength. Rigid certainty is brittle. Adaptive clarity is resilient. In a culture increasingly polarized by emotional absolutism, this resilience stands out. It attracts some, it angers others. Those invested in emotional extremes often interpret calm as complicity or betrayal. The sovereign individual accepts this misunderstanding. They do not rush to prove their virtue. They do not perform outrage to signal belonging. They allow their actions, over time, to speak. This long view orientation is increasingly rare. Most people are trapped in short emotional cycles. They react, express, move on, repeat. Memory is shallow. Lessons are not integrated. The same patterns recur under new labels. Emotional sovereignty interrupts this loop. By slowing reaction, it allows learning to accumulate. Experience compounds rather than resets. Over years, this produces wisdom rather than fatigue. Wisdom is not a personality trait. It is the byproduct of unhurried attention over time. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often withdraw slightly from constant commentary. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they refuse to speak without clarity. Silence becomes a filter. Only what passes through coherence emerges. This restraint is misread in a culture that equates visibility with relevance. But relevance measured by noise is short-lived. Relevance measured by impact endures. Impact requires depth. Depth requires stillness. Stillness requires sovereignty. This chain explains why emotional sovereignty is not merely a personal virtue, but a cultural necessity. Without it, societies oscillate between extremes, manipulated by whoever can stimulate the strongest reaction. With it, societies slow down, dialogue becomes possible, complexity can be held without collapse. This may sound idealistic. It is not. It is structural. Emotional regulation at the individual level scales into stability at the collective level. Dysregulation scales into chaos. The individual who cultivates sovereignty contributes to order simply by existing differently. They become a point of coherence in an incoherent system. Others unconsciously adjust around them. This influence is subtle. It does not announce itself, but it accumulates. From here, the essay will continue to push further into the most difficult territory of all. What emotional sovereignty demands when everything familiar is taken away. When status, security, and certainty collapse, and when the individual must stand with nothing but their inner alignment. There comes a moment in every serious life when the scaffolding falls away. Status evaporates. Certainty fractures. Roles lose authority. The story you told yourself about who you were no longer explains what is happening. For most people, this moment feels like annihilation. They panic not because pain is present, but because identity has lost its anchor. Without titles, routines, recognition, or future guarantees, the mind scrambles to restore control. It grasps at explanations, scapegoats, ideologies, anything that can quickly rebuild a sense of orientation. This is where emotional sovereignty reveals its final function. It is not designed for comfort. It is designed for collapse. When everything external fails, the only thing that remains is the relationship you have with your inner state. Those who have outsourced this relationship to circumstance find themselves hollow. Those who have cultivated sovereignty remain intact. Intact does not mean unaffected. It means unbroken. This distinction matters. Crisis strips away pretense. It exposes whether calm was performative or embodied. Many people who appeared confident under stable conditions disintegrate when uncertainty becomes total. Their composure depended on predictability. The sovereign individual does not require predictability to remain coherent. This does not make them fearless. Fear still arises, but fear is no longer mistaken for command. It is felt, acknowledged, and held without being obeyed. This capacity, to feel fear without letting it dictate behavior, is the core of courage. Courage is not absence of fear. It is absence of submission to fear. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often navigate crises with an unsettling steadiness. Others interpret this as denial or emotional detachment. It is neither. It is clarity under pressure. Pressure collapses what is unnecessary. In crisis, all secondary concerns fall away. What remains are values. If values are unclear, Panic ensues. If values are integrated, action emerges. This is why emotional sovereignty must be cultivated before crisis arrives. It cannot be installed at the moment of collapse. Under pressure, the nervous system defaults to its deepest patterns. Training reveals itself. Stoicism was never about mild inconvenience. It was forged in exile, war, loss, and execution. Its insights survive because they were tested at the extreme edges of human experience. The Stoics understood that the question is not whether adversity will arrive, but whether the self will remain intact when it does. Carl Jung observed the same truth psychologically. He noted that neurosis often emerges when a person's conscious identity no longer fits the reality they are facing. Crisis is not always pathological. Sometimes it is the psyche demanding reorganization. The danger lies in resisting this demand. Most people cling to outdated identities because letting them go feels like death. Emotional sovereignty provides the capacity to let go without collapse. It allows identity to loosen without the self disintegrating. This is not nihilism. It is maturation. Maturity is the willingness to revise oneself in the face of reality. The reactive individual cannot do this. Revision feels like defeat. Adaptation feels like humiliation. They double down on old narratives even as those narratives fail. This rigidity intensifies suffering. The sovereign individual yields strategically. Yielding here does not mean surrendering values. It means surrendering illusions. It means allowing reality to correct fantasy. This correction is painful, but it is clarifying. Clarity is what allows movement forward. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often emerge from crisis transformed rather than traumatized. Trauma is not caused by pain alone. It is caused by pain overwhelming the psyche's capacity to integrate it. Sovereignty increases capacity. It expands the container that holds experience. Pain still enters, but it does not shatter structure. Grief still arrives, but it does not erase meaning. Loss still occurs, but it does not annihilate selfhood. This expanded capacity is what allows grief to be metabolized rather than stored. Stored grief becomes bitterness. Integrated grief becomes depth. Depth is the quiet gift of surviving collapse with awareness. This depth reshapes how one relates to future uncertainty. The sovereign individual no longer overestimates catastrophe. They have already experienced identity death and survived. They know, viscerally, that coherence can persist even when everything else changes. This knowledge cannot be taught. It must be lived. And once lived, it becomes unshakable. From this place, ambition changes again. Goals remain, but they are no longer life or death propositions. Failure loses its existential sting. Success loses its intoxicating pull. Effort becomes expression rather than survival strategy. This does not diminish achievement. It stabilizes it. The sovereign individual can build without desperation. They can rebuild after loss without bitterness. They can walk away from what no longer aligns without resentment. Resentment is what traps most people in the past. They replay injustices as identity. They nurse grievances as proof of significance. Emotional sovereignty releases this burden, not by forgetting harm, but by refusing to let harm define the future. Forgiveness, in this context, is not moral absolution. It is strategic disengagement from psychological captivity. It is choosing freedom over perpetual reaction. This choice becomes especially clear after collapse. When everything has been stripped away, clinging to resentment feels absurd. The sovereign individual understands that carrying hatred into the future is like rebuilding on unstable ground. They choose solidity instead. Solidity is not certainty. It is alignment. Alignment between values and action. Alignment between emotion and awareness. Alignment between inner climate and outer behavior. This alignment becomes the new center. From here, the essay will continue toward its final horizon. What a life organized around emotional sovereignty looks like over decades. How it ages, and why those who cultivate it early experience a different kind of fulfillment later, one that does not depend on peak experiences, but on sustained coherence. Over long stretches of time, emotional sovereignty reveals its most understated power. It does not announce itself in youth, where intensity is mistaken for depth and reaction is mistaken for authenticity. Its value compounds slowly, almost invisibly, across years. Only later does the difference become unmistakable. People age differently depending on how they have related to their inner life. Some age hardened, bitter, rigid, suspicious. Their faces carry the residue of decades spent reacting, defending, resenting. Their nervous systems never learn to rest. Their stories are filled with blame and unfinished arguments. Others age softened but intact. Their presence feels grounded. Their words are measured. Their eyes carry clarity rather than exhaustion. They have known disappointment, loss, and regret, but these experiences did not calcify into identity. The difference is not luck. It is sovereignty. Emotional sovereignty changes how time is metabolized. Reactive individuals accumulate emotional debt. Every unresolved conflict, every unexamined resentment, every suppressed fear compounds. Over decades, this debt becomes character. The sovereign individual settles emotional accounts as they arise. Feelings are processed, not stored. Conflicts are addressed or released. Grief is allowed to complete its cycle. The psyche remains mobile. Mobility is what keeps a person alive internally. This internal mobility allows one to adapt as the body changes. As speed decreases, presence increases. As ambition recalibrates, meaning deepens. The sovereign individual does not cling to former versions of themselves. They allow identity to evolve without mourning its previous shape. This capacity becomes especially important in aging, where loss is cumulative. Loss of strength, loss of role, loss of relevance, loss of certainty. For many, these losses feel humiliating because identity was bound to performance. Emotional sovereignty loosens this bind early. The self is not reduced when ability changes. Dignity is preserved because it was never outsourced to capacity. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often age with grace rather than resistance. Grace here is not elegance. It is acceptance without resignation. They do not romanticize decline. They also do not fight it with denial. They adjust intelligently. They invest energy where it still yields meaning. They withdraw where effort becomes corrosive. This discernment protects against despair. Despair arises when reality is experienced as betrayal. Sovereignty prevents this by aligning expectation with impermanence. Change is anticipated. Loss is integrated. Nothing feels personal in the cosmic sense, even when it is intimate. This perspective does not make grief disappear. It makes grief navigable. Navigable grief does not isolate. It deepens connection. Sovereign individuals grieve without demanding that others fix it. They allow support without dependency. They honor pain without turning it into narrative domination. This maturity alters relationships across decades. Friends of convenience fall away. Relationships based on shared growth remain. The sovereign individual does not chase relevance. They cultivate resonance, fewer connections, deeper roots. This selectivity is not elitism. It is conservation of emotional energy. Energy conserved over decades produces wisdom. Wisdom is not the accumulation of insight. It is the absence of unnecessary struggle. The sovereign individual no longer fights battles that do not matter. They choose silence where speech would add noise. They choose action where action aligns with values. This economy of effort creates space for what remains essential. In later life, this often manifests as mentorship rather than dominance, guidance rather than control, presence rather than instruction. The sovereign individual does not impose lessons. They embody them. Embodiment is the only form of teaching that survives time. This is the quiet legacy emotional sovereignty leaves behind. Not monuments, not recognition, but regulated presence that stabilizes others. Children feel it, colleagues sense it, communities benefit from it without naming it. This legacy cannot be engineered. It emerges naturally from decades of internal coherence. Coherence is what allows a life to feel complete even without closure. Most people fear aging because they equate value with accumulation of status. Stories, accomplishments. Emotional sovereignty redefines value as alignment sustained over time. A life does not need to be impressive to be meaningful. It needs to be internally consistent. Consistency is what gives peace at the end. When the sovereign individual looks back, they do not see perfection. They see congruence, choices that made sense given what was known, corrections made when clarity increased, apologies offered without self-annihilation, boundaries held without cruelty. Regret still exists, but it is proportional. Proportional regret teaches. Disproportionate regret cripples. This proportionality is the final gift of emotional sovereignty. It allows one to live with one's past without being imprisoned by it. From here, the essay is ready to move toward its final arc, not a conclusion, but a settling, a long landing into what emotional sovereignty ultimately offers, not control, not immunity, but a life that can be inhabited fully without being hijacked by its own reactions. Eventually, the question stops being how to maintain emotional sovereignty. The question becomes whether anything else is worth maintaining without it. At this stage, the individual no longer seeks techniques. Techniques were scaffolding. What remains is orientation, a quiet internal compass that does not point toward pleasure or avoidance, but toward coherence. Coherence becomes the primary metric. Not happiness. Not success. Not approval. Coherence. This shift is subtle enough that many people never notice it happening. Life simply feels less antagonistic. Situations that once felt charged now feel informational. Emotional spikes flatten into waves that rise and fall without consequence. The nervous system spends more time in baseline than in alert. This baseline is not numbness. It is availability. Availability to think clearly. Availability to feel without fear. Availability to act without compulsion. From this state, the individual begins to experience life less as a series of problems to solve and more as a field of conditions to navigate. Problems demand urgency. Conditions invite intelligence. Intelligence thrives without panic. This is why emotionally sovereign individuals often appear slower in their responses. They are not slow, they are unhurried. They allow enough time for perception to complete itself before action is taken. This timing gives their decisions weight. Weight comes from integration. Integrated responses are difficult to argue with. They do not escalate. They do not provoke counterreaction. They land, settle, and reorganize the space around them. This is why sovereign individuals often find that conflicts resolve around them without direct intervention. The system adjusts. This adjustment is not mystical. It is relational physics. Calm reduces noise. Reduced noise reveals signal. Signal allows coordination. Coordination replaces conflict. Over time, this produces a life that feels less dramatic but more substantial. Fewer emotional highs, fewer emotional lows, more continuity, more follow-through, more trust in one's own judgment. Trust is essential here. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in process. Trust that clarity will return even when temporarily lost. Trust that emotions will pass without being acted upon. Trust that integrity does not require immediate validation. This trust stabilizes the psyche. A stable psyche no longer needs to rehearse the future constantly. Planning still happens, but it is proportional. The mind is not consumed by contingency management. It accepts that uncertainty is structural, not a flaw to be eliminated. This acceptance frees enormous cognitive and emotional resources. Those resources are then redirected toward presence. Presence is where meaning quietly accumulates. Meaning, in this context, is not purpose imposed from outside. It is the felt sense that one's actions are congruent with one's values. It is the absence of inner contradiction. It is the relief of not having to pretend. Pretending is exhausting. Most people spend enormous energy maintaining emotional personas, who they are supposed to be, how they are supposed to feel, what they are supposed to want. Emotional sovereignty dismantles this performance. What remains is simpler, quieter, and far more sustainable. This simplicity is not minimalism. It is honesty. Honesty about limits. Honesty about motives. Honesty about fear without being governed by it. This honesty deepens self-respect. Self-respect here does not depend on achievement. It depends on self-consistency. The sovereign individual respects themselves because they know they will not abandon their own values under pressure. This knowledge is grounding. Grounding allows rest. Rest is another misunderstood consequence of emotional sovereignty. Rest does not mean inactivity. It means the absence of internal warfare. The body can finally downshift because it is no longer bracing against imagined threats. Sleep improves. Health stabilizes. Mood becomes less volatile. These changes are often noticed by others before the individual consciously registers them. People comment on calmness, presence, steadiness. The sovereign individual does not cultivate these traits deliberately. They emerge as side effects. Side effects of not fighting oneself. At this stage, the individual's relationship with achievement changes again. Goals still exist, but they are held lightly. Success does not inflate the self. Failure does not collapse it. Work becomes contribution rather than compensation. This reframing removes much of the hidden cruelty people direct at themselves. Self-criticism softens, not because standards disappear, but because they are no longer weaponized. Improvement becomes curiosity-driven rather than shame-driven. Effort is sustained by interest rather than fear. Fear-driven effort always burns out. Interest-driven effort endures. This endurance is what allows emotionally sovereign individuals to remain engaged across long arcs of time without becoming cynical. They can care deeply without being consumed. They can witness suffering without collapsing into despair. They can contribute without expecting the world to reciprocate. Expectation is what corrodes generosity. Sovereignty removes expectation by removing entitlement to outcomes. One acts because it aligns, not because it guarantees return. This orientation protects against bitterness. Bitterness is unresolved expectation. The sovereign individual has learned, often through disappointment, that the world does not owe coherence to anyone. Coherence must be generated internally. Once generated, it becomes portable. Portable coherence is freedom. You carry it into relationships, into work, into uncertainty, into aging, into loss. It does not prevent pain. It prevents fragmentation. This is the quiet truth at the center of emotional sovereignty. You cannot control what happens, but you can control whether it divides you internally. Division is suffering. Integration is peace. Peace here is not bliss. It is the absence of internal opposition. The parts of the self are no longer at war. Desire, fear, reason, and value move in the same direction. When this alignment stabilizes, life no longer feels like something you must constantly manage. It becomes something you can inhabit. Inhabiting life fully does not require certainty. It requires presence. Presence does not require happiness. It requires permission to feel without judgment. Emotional sovereignty grants that permission. And once granted, there is very little left to chase. At this depth, emotional sovereignty no longer feels like strength. It feels like normalcy restored. You begin to realize that most of what people call passion, intensity, or authenticity is simply dysregulation normalized by culture. The sovereign state does not feel elevated. It feels unburdened. The absence of constant inner friction reveals how much energy was previously wasted on internal negotiation. This realization is sobering. You see clearly how much of life is organized around compensating for unresolved emotional patterns. Careers chosen to outrun insecurity. Relationships maintained to regulate anxiety. Beliefs adopted to justify resentment. Once sovereignty stabilizes, these compensations lose urgency. Urgency itself becomes suspect. Reactive urgency always demands immediate action. It frames delay as danger. It insists that something must be done now, spoken now, decided now. Emotional sovereignty introduces a different tempo. A tempo that allows things to ripen. Ripening is incompatible with panic. This shift in tempo is perhaps the most noticeable external marker of sovereignty. The individual moves more slowly, not in physical speed, but in psychological pace. Decisions are fewer but firmer. Words are fewer but cleaner. Emotional expenditure becomes deliberate. This deliberateness changes how mistakes are handled. The reactive person experiences mistakes as identity threats. They rush to defend, rationalize, or conceal. The sovereign individual experiences mistakes as data. They extract information without self-attack. Correction happens quietly. Shame does not take over. Shame is what keeps most people immature. Shame collapses the self. It forces the psyche into either submission or defiance. Neither produces growth. Emotional sovereignty dissolves shame by removing the belief that error diminishes worth. Worth is no longer at stake. When worth is not on the line, learning accelerates. Adaptation becomes fluid. The individual can revise without humiliation. This flexibility is often mistaken for lack of conviction. In reality, it is confidence unbound from ego. This ego-light posture changes how one handles power. Power no longer intoxicates. Influence no longer demands expansion. Authority is exercised proportionally. The sovereign individual does not overreach. They sense the limits of their competence and respect them. Overreach is the signature of insecurity. This restraint produces trust. Others trust the sovereign individual not because they promise certainty, but because they demonstrate judgment. Judgment grounded in regulation. Regulation grounded in self-knowledge. This trust accumulates slowly and rarely collapses suddenly. Trust built on performance collapses under pressure. Trust built on coherence endures. This endurance is what allows emotionally sovereign individuals to remain relevant without remaining visible. They do not need constant reaffirmation. Their presence is remembered because it was stabilizing, not stimulating. Stimulation fades. Stability persists. At this stage of life, the sovereign individual often becomes less interested in being understood and more interested in being accurate. They speak when clarity is available. They remain silent when it is not. They allow misunderstanding to exist if correcting it would introduce distortion. This tolerance for misunderstanding is a profound marker of maturity. Most people exhaust themselves trying to manage how they are perceived. Emotional sovereignty abandons this project. Perception is recognized as uncontrollable. Integrity becomes the only manageable variable. Integrity simplifies life dramatically. It removes the need for image maintenance. It removes the compulsion to explain. It removes the internal conflict between who one is and who one appears to be. This congruence is deeply restful. Rest here does not mean withdrawal from effort. It means effort without internal resistance. Work done without self-betrayal feels lighter. Even when demanding, rest becomes restorative rather than escapist. Escapist rest is a symptom of misalignment. Aligned effort replenishes itself. This self-replenishing quality is why emotionally sovereign individuals often maintain vitality into later decades. Their energy is not drained by constant emotional friction. They are not carrying unresolved conflicts as background load. Background load is what ages people prematurely. The sovereign individual sheds background load continuously. Emotions arise, are felt, are released. No backlog accumulates. The psyche remains lean. Leanness allows presence. Presence allows meaning. Meaning here is not narrative. It is experiential. It is the felt sense that one's life is not internally divided. That actions flow from values without excessive distortion. That one is not constantly betraying oneself for comfort or approval. This is enough. The culture may tell you it is not enough. That you should want more excitement, more recognition, more intensity. Emotional sovereignty reveals this pressure as external noise. Noise fades when not fed. What remains is a life that does not need to be justified. This is the quiet endpoint most people never imagine because it lacks spectacle. There is no dramatic climax, no final revelation, just continuity, a steady inhabiting of days without internal sabotage. This is why emotional sovereignty is invisible to those who do not practice it. It does not perform, it does not preach, it simply persists. And persistence, over decades, is what shapes a life. A life shaped by sovereignty does not avoid pain. It avoids disintegration. It does not avoid loss. It avoids collapse. It does not avoid conflict. It avoids self-abandonment. This avoidance of self-abandonment is the deepest form of self-respect available. Self-respect not as pride, but as reliability, the knowledge that you will not turn against yourself when things become difficult. That knowledge is stabilizing. From here, the essay is approaching its final density, not a conclusion, but a settled silence, where nothing more needs to be added, only allowed to stand. In the end, emotional sovereignty does not promise a life without pain. It promises a life without inner betrayal. And that difference is everything. Pain is unavoidable, loss will come, misunderstanding will happen, people will disappoint you, circumstances will collapse at the worst possible time. None of this is negotiable. What is negotiable is whether these events fracture you internally or pass through a structure that can hold them. Most people are not destroyed by what happens to them. They are destroyed by how quickly they abandon themselves when it happens. They turn against their own values to relieve discomfort. They surrender clarity for approval. They trade long-term coherence for short-term relief. Emotional sovereignty is the refusal to make that trade. It is the decision, quiet, repeated, often invisible, to remain internally aligned even when doing so costs comfort, validation, or certainty. It is choosing not to react when reaction would feel justified, not because you are weak, but because you are no longer willing to give away authority over your inner state. This is not a dramatic victory. It is a durable one. There is no applause for emotional sovereignty, no external reward, often, no recognition at all. What it offers instead is something far more valuable, a life you can inhabit without flinching. A life where emotions are felt fully but do not rule. Where identity is flexible but not fragile. Where silence is not emptiness, but strength. Where action flows from values rather than impulse. In this life, happiness stops being chased and starts appearing, quietly, unpredictably, as a byproduct of alignment rather than an objective to be achieved. Peace is no longer a mood. It becomes the absence of internal opposition. You stop needing the world to cooperate in order to remain whole. That is the deepest freedom available to a human being. Not freedom from hardship, but freedom from being internally torn apart by it. When you possess this freedom, something subtle but irreversible changes. You speak less, but with more weight. You react less, but with more accuracy. You need less explanation, less reassurance, less permission. You are no longer trying to prove your worth to the world. You are no longer asking life to justify itself to you. You meet it as it is. This is emotional sovereignty. Not a technique. Not a philosophy. Not a performance. But a way of standing inside your own experience without being owned by it. And once that way of standing is learned, nothing essential can ever be taken from you again.